I once knelt in a kitchen, hands covered in flour and tears, as my father declared to everyone, she chose to be the family's failure. 10 years later, he had to sign a partnership deal with me, the daughter he once erased. I didn't seek revenge with a knife. I used success. I didn't destroy their empire. I rewrote its blood. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong, Ed. Hit subscribe now to follow more raw, emotional, and redemptive stories like this one. Before I was erased from the family books, I believed blood would never turn its back. But they did through silence. The grand ballroom of the Global Culinary Congress was lit like a cathedral of ambition. Glass chandeliers dripping with cold, light velvet walls soaking up the whispers of industry giants. Every table bore names etched in gold. Every chair housed a legacy, a celebrity chef, a founder with their surname printed on product labels in 5 languages. Except for her, Lila Torres. Though no one knew that was her name tonight, stepped into the room wearing a deep navy suit tailored to precision. Her hair was twisted into a neat chignon, a single diamond pin glinting like an afterthought. She walked with the exact calm of someone who knew where she belonged, but also knew the world wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. No name card, no introduction, no entourage. She was there as a guest of the host company Bloomline Holdings, the company she'd built from flour, fire, and fury. Her own name scrubbed from every registration form, every press release. She watched as a panelist referred to Bloomline as a surprising new force and smirked when a European CEO speculated that its leadership was probably some investor's wife with a flair for publicity. Her espresso arrived. She didn't touch it. Because 10 years ago in a house filled with glassware and glares, her life had changed. The dining room had been designed by a French architect and decorated in cold marble and darker expectations. At the head of the table, Alfredo Torres, father chairman of Torres Foods, and the type of man whose voice lowered when women spoke, was mid-sentence when Lila interrupted him for the first time in her life. "I'm not going back to law school." The silence was sharp enough to slice the veal roast steaming in the center of the table. Her mother's hand trembled slightly on her wineglass. Her brothers, Diego, Marco, and Elias, exchanged amused glances like they'd just heard a child threaten to move out with her piggy bank. "You what?" Alfredo asked, voice still composed but narrowing. "I said I'm not going back. I withdrew last week." He stared at her, blinking slowly, and "I want to study pastry arts, baking." The silence turned icy. Her mother made a small choking sound, either from disbelief or shame. Marco snorted. Diego tilted his head, trying not to laugh. Elias leaned back with a theatrical sigh. Then came Clara, still fiancée at the time, sitting just beside Elias, her sleek phone angled just so, filming discreetly under the table. Alfredo folded his hands, knuckles white. "So you've decided to throw away an Ivy League legal education to make cupcakes." "Not cupcakes," Lila replied, holding her ground. "Breads, custards, laminated doughs, and a lot more integrity than what's in your supply chain right now." Diego chuckled. "Ah, so it's one of those feminist rebellions, huh? Eat cake, don't sue?" "Don't be childish," Elias chimed in. "She wants to play with flour. Let her open a bakery. She'll be broke in 6 months." Her mother finally found her voice, tearful and trembling. "Lila, sweetheart, you're emotional. Maybe it's stress. You were always dramatic after exams. Let's talk about this after the holidays." "I already applied to the Culinary Institute," Lila said. "I start in March." The air went still. Her father pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the marble. "Then I hope," he said quietly, "you understand that adult decisions come with adult consequences." Meaning no more tuition, no more apartment, no more Torres family trust? She was effectively erased. No one raised their voice. That was the Torres way. Disappointment was served cold. And so the next day, the family convened again, not for discussion, but declaration. Lila sat alone on the far side of the formal parlor while they decided what to do with her. Alfredo spoke like she wasn't in the room. "Remove her from the company health insurance," he told the accountant over speakerphone. "And the platinum card. She'll be back," Marco said, lounging on the leather couch. "Let her live off croissants for a month." "You could have at least gone into marketing," her mother said, dabbing at her eyes. "Like I did before I married your father." "She's not cut out for anything that needs data," Elias added. "Remember that school project on food trucks, total disaster?" And Clara, with her ever-silent smirk, stood in the back filming again. This time the lens caught Lila's hands gripping the spiral-bound notebook on her lap. Esperanza's recipes, written in looping cursive and oil stains, inherited from a grandmother who used to whisper, "There is a war in this family, child, but you can bake your way out." They gave her 48 hours to pack. When she left, it was raining, not dramatically, just annoyingly. Her Uber driver asked if she was moving. She said no, just going somewhere that felt more honest. She carried 2 suitcases, her recipe notebook, and $46 in her bank account. Her phone buzzed once with a final transfer, a terse $500 from her mother. The memo line read, "Last support." No one came to say goodbye. No one watched her go. And so Boston disappeared in the rear window like a memory she'd one day burned to sugar. New York did not welcome her. She slept the first night in a friend of a friend's spare room, curled up beside the radiator with an apple and 2 slices of bread. On the 3rd day, she applied to 7 bakeries. By the 7th day, she'd scrubbed a grease-coated sink until her knuckles split, but had a job. Her first uniform was 3 sizes too big. The apron string tied twice around her waist. She was assigned the late shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. cleaning mixers, restocking flour bins, sifting sugar that stuck together like wet sand. She wasn't allowed to bake. Not yet. But when the head baker, an older woman named Janice, got sick, Lila offered to help prep croissants. The assistant rolled his eyes but let her try. By 5 a.m., 24 golden crescents sat steaming in the display case. They sold out in under an hour. The next night, she was assigned to lamination, then to fillings. Then she stayed 2 extra hours to rework the vanilla bean ratios in the custard. Janice returned and took 1 bite of the revised eclair before silently nodding. Lila's palms were blistered. Her spine ached like it belonged to someone twice her age. She worked through migraines, through silence, through the lingering echo of her father's voice, throwing away an education for cupcakes. But she'd tasted what they never could. Not just sweetness, conviction. And now, 10 years later, in that Congress ballroom filled with Michelin stars and IPO whispers, she sipped her water like it was wine and watched the industry murmur over Bloomline's mysterious leadership. No one looked at her. But they would, soon. Bloomline wasn't supposed to have a name. It was just meant to be a kitchen somewhere Lila could work without talking somewhere. The scent of browned butter and yeast could cover the sound of old words still echoing in her chest. But kitchens like people don't stay invisible forever. It began with a folding table in Brooklyn. Lila had rented the smallest commercial space she could afford, barely 200 square feet, wedged between a pet grooming salon and a laundromat that reeked of mildew and bleach. She slept on a cot in the back. For the first 8 months, her legs often cramped from the angle. A second-hand convection oven sat like a stubborn dog in the corner, and her grandmother's notebook was taped to the wall beside it, some pages water-warped, others stained with lemon curd. The bakery didn't have a sign for the first 3 months, just a hand-lettered chalkboard that read "Brioche hot at 7." But they came. First, an exhausted nurse from the clinic 2 blocks down, then a father with twin daughters in tow, then a writer who posted a photo on Instagram with the caption, "Best almond croissant of my goddamn life." No name, no line, just butter and grace. 3 months later, that photo showed up in a piece in the Brooklyn Crumb, a snide little local food blog, half gossip, half gospel. The article was titled, "The No-Name Oven That Might Be Worth a Name." Lila didn't read it at first. She only saw the spike in orders. People started showing up asking for the croissant place. A designer offered to make her a logo for free. She declined. Then a couple from Tribeca asked if she'd cater their brunch wedding, just 20 guests intimate. She almost said no. Then she remembered what her father used to say at investor dinners: growth hides in your first yes. So she did it. And when the bride cried over the Earl Grey Madeleines, something in Lila cracked, not from pressure, but permission. She ordered a proper sign 2 weeks later, a slim metal script in white. Just one word: Bloomline. It was the name her grandmother used to describe a row of rising doughs on a wooden shelf where fermentation became promise. It wasn't a legal surname, but it was hers. By year 3, the bakery had a second location and a small column in edible Manhattan. And yet when Lila sent pitch decks to potential investors, angel funds, startup grants, seed rounds, the answer was always the same: no degree. No formal business experience, no male co-founder. Come back when you've got traction, one VC said. Looks more like a passion project, said another. A third emailed her back with, "We love female-led brands. Maybe find a celebrity partner. Let us know if Oprah bites." She nearly threw her laptop out the window that night. Instead, she doubled her baking schedule and started teaching herself QuickBooks and SQL between batches of cruffins. But burnout doesn't care about willpower. It hit her one Thursday night when she fell asleep on a crate of flour, woke up with her back twisted, and sobbed into the walk-in fridge. She was inches from closing the second store. Then Minji came in. She wore orthopedic shoes and a black beret that made her look like a retired assassin. Minji had once been executive pastry chef at a Michelin-starred hotel in Seoul, and she knew lamination when she tasted it. She walked into Bloomline just after opening one rainy morning, didn't say a word, ordered a pain au chocolat, took one bite, and said, "You didn't overproof, and you didn't cry." Lila blinked. "Excuse me?" "Croissant is like man," Minji said. "You show it too much emotion, it collapses." She came back the next day, and the next. On the 4th visit, she asked Lila to sit. She pulled out a check from her purse and slid it across the counter. $50,000, she said, "from my retirement. This isn't pity, it's investment. I know what it costs to survive men who don't think your hands count." Lila stared at the check for a long time. "What do you want in return?" Minji sipped her coffee. "Only that you keep making that laminated bastard sing." The check cleared 2 days later, and Bloomline's fate turned again. With Minji's money, Lila hired a proper operations manager, bought a new oven, designed a clean grayscale visual identity, opened a pop-up in Union Market in D.C. that sold out for 3 weeks straight. She still refused interviews, still signed everything as L. Everlyn, still insisted the founder remained private. It wasn't humility, it was armor, because there were still headlines in Boston. Still features about Torres Foods' upcoming product launches, their family-run legacy, their next generation of leadership. The articles mentioned Elias often. Sometimes Clara. Never her. And then came the wedding. She wasn't invited. Of course not. It was never a question. But when an old high school friend, one of the few who hadn't unfollowed her after her disappearance, forwarded the online registry, she knew exactly where and when. The church was old stone framed by ivy and hollow formality. Lila wore black because that's what people wear to funerals. She stood across the street behind a tree, her eyes shielded by sunglasses, even though the sky was gray. From that distance, everything looked surreal. Clara stepping out of the limo in a lace-trimmed dress, her mother arranging the veil, her brothers in matching gray tuxedos. Lila's father stood at the entrance like a proud general nodding at guests as if bestowing favor. The whole performance felt like a lie she used to believe. She clutched her sleeve, the fabric twisting in her hand. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stared until the doors closed behind them all. Then she turned and walked away. She took the long route home, past the bakery where she used to buy bagels with Elias, past the park where Clara once told her she didn't really fit with the family, past the window of a bookstore where her mother once tried to convince her that dreams are fine, but they don't pay for property tax. By the time she reached the subway, her breath had steadied. Her heart hadn't. That night, she baked 12 dozen cinnamon knots. She braided the dough tighter than usual, the sugar caramelized into sharp gold crusts. She packed them in brown boxes, unlabeled, unbranded, and gave them to the homeless shelter 3 blocks down. And when the volunteer asked who made them, she just said, "No one special," because she wasn't yet. But she would be, not because of revenge, not for applause, but because there were women like Minji who gave her 50,000 reasons to stay upright. Because the dough kept rising, and one day, so would her name. By year 10, Torres Foods. Once the pride of Boston's corporate skyline was no longer known for its artisanal soups or family-owned charm. It was known for botulism. The first incident surfaced on a Thursday morning in early March. A 4-year-old girl in Connecticut was hospitalized after consuming a canned chicken stew labeled Organic Heritage, Torres family recipe. By Friday afternoon, 5 more hospitalizations emerged in New Jersey, all traced back to the same batch. On Monday, a class action lawsuit had begun assembling in Chicago. CNN covered it in a breaking chyron. By Tuesday, Torres toxins was trending on Twitter. Lila read the news at 4:30 a.m. in the quiet of Bloomline's production kitchen, a smear of raspberry glaze still fresh on her sleeve. Her stomach turned not from shock, but from certainty. She hadn't touched a can of Torres product in years. Not since she knew what passed for family recipe was whatever preserved cheapest and longest. She pulled up the FDA's recall bulletin, lot numbers, factory IDs, locations. Then she looked deeper into the web of contracts and supplier invoices still loosely tied to the Torres name. The deeper she went, the more the rot showed. By Wednesday, 31 confirmed illnesses. By Friday, Alfredo Torres stood in front of a cluster of microphones in a navy pinstripe suit, insisting it was a tragic vendor oversight. His voice carried that same cold precision he used to use at the dinner table. No apology, no ownership, just quiet dismissal. "Our internal audits," he said smoothly, "have always maintained the highest standards. This issue appears to be a breach of contract by our third-party supplier in Oregon. We're pursuing legal remedies." Lila stared at the screen in her office as the cameras flashed. Her father's face looked older, yes, but not different. Still marble, still unbreakable, still lying through immaculate teeth. The camera cut to Clara, standing just over his left shoulder in a navy dress and pearl earrings. Clara nodded solemnly as her father-in-law spoke. Her arms were crossed in front of her chest, but her knuckles were relaxed. Not stressed, not stunned, just performing. Lila narrowed her eyes. She opened her laptop and began cross-referencing Torres Foods' most recent shipment schedules with publicly available vendor registration logs. It took 22 minutes to find the shell company, Relino Distributions, LLC, incorporated in Delaware. Listed address: a virtual mailbox in Las Vegas. No real website. But one shared contact appeared across several invoices: C. Torres Mendez. Clara. The last name Mendez was her maiden name. Lila recognized it from the wedding announcement she was never invited to. Relino wasn't just the vendor. It was the vendor created to supply expired off-spec and third-rate ingredients to Torres Foods' most profitable lines at wholesale markup. Clara had quietly maneuvered her way into both sides of the ledger, slashing costs for the company while overcharging them through her own front. And she had funneled every ounce of profit into private accounts shielded behind international holding firms. And now people were in hospitals. And Clara still standing behind microphones. Lila sat back in her chair. She didn't move for several long minutes. This wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. She thought about calling a journalist, a lawyer, a food safety watchdog. She could end this tonight. But something inside her said no. She didn't want to destroy Torres Foods. She wanted to take it. Not out of revenge, not entirely, but because she knew with blistering clarity that if she didn't, someone worse would. So she opened a secure line and dialed her legal advisor in San Francisco. "Is Vespera Capital still clean?" she asked. Fully anonymous came the reply. "You want to activate the acquisition front?" "Yes," she said, "and I want to start buying." The voice paused. "Buying what?" "Torres Foods." There was a silence. "I thought you never wanted to see that name again." "I don't," Lila said. "But I want to save the people who still believe in it." The next week was war in silk gloves. She assembled a ghost team, lawyers, analysts, financial scouts, all operating behind the shell firm Vespera Capital. She funded it quietly, pulling from Bloomline's corporate profits, personal savings, and a pair of venture lines tied to non-traceable holding firms. She kept herself invisible. She never signed, she never called, she watched. Meanwhile, Torres Foods bled. Customers fled in droves. Retailers pulled products off shelves. Kroger, then Target. Then Whole Foods dropped them with a line so devastating Lila printed it out and stuck it above her sink. "We no longer have confidence in Torres Foods' commitment to safety." Stockholders panicked. The board panicked. By the third week, the company had lost 37% of its market value. And Clara remained untouchable. She'd buried her tracks too well. The supplier company had folded overnight after the scandal with no paper trail leading to her door unless someone was looking very, very closely. Lila was. One night in the glow of her laptop, she unearthed a single transaction, a wire from Releno Distributions to a luxury skincare clinic in Geneva. Under the client's name, Clara T. Mendez. She had been using business profits to fund private regenerative skin therapy. People were sick in hospital beds, and Clara was paying for collagen infusions in Switzerland. Lila closed her laptop so hard the sound cracked the air. She walked into the Bloomline test kitchen, pulled down a tray of Queen Amans, and threw the whole batch into the bin. She didn't sleep that night. At sunrise, she opened a bottle of sparkling water, took a sip, and sat down with Minji. "I need to tell you something," she said. Minji didn't blink. "You want to burn the castle?" "I want to buy the castle," Lila corrected. "Then gut the rotting beams and rebuild it properly." "And your name?" "No one sees it, not yet." Minji stirred her tea. "Then make sure when they do, it's after the walls are clean." They clinked glasses. That same day, Vespera Capital made its first formal approach to Torres Foods Investment Bank under the guise of a distressed asset acquisition interest. It was cold, legal, clean. The paperwork didn't mention Lila. The offer was aggressive but structured with care, keep some legacy family involvement, but strip the executive core. Clara would be gone. Lila watched from her office as her father's face appeared again on television, flanked by lawyers now. He looked like a shadow of the man she remembered, grayer, thinner, still refusing to admit wrongdoing. When asked if the family would step down, Alfredo said, "We are weighing all options to protect the legacy of this brand." Lila smiled darkly. That legacy was already in her freezer. Later that night, she sat in front of her grandmother's notebook and reread a quote Esperanza had scribbled at the bottom of a blueberry pie recipe. "Don't just wait for the rot to fall. Cut it before it poisons the next harvest." Lila tore out the page, not to destroy it, to carry it with her. Because this wasn't war, not anymore. This was reclamation. and the battlefield was her birthright. The room was windowless by design. A converted basement office in downtown San Francisco with no reception desk, no logo on the door. Just a keypad lock and a paper shredder that hummed like a throat clearing every 30 seconds. The air tasted like metal and urgency. Lila sat across from Elias Grant, her legal architect for Invisible Power. He wore gray. Everything gray jacket, gray mind, gray mood. The kind of man who could dissolve an identity with a signature and smile politely while doing it. "The entities are ready," he said, pushing a folder across the table. 7 total routed through Luxembourg, Singapore, and Delaware. Vespera sits on top. The rest are layered like Russian dolls. Clean, discreet, yours. Lila flipped through the pages slowly, her thumb grazing the cold weight of the paper. And ownership, untraceable. No direct links, not even your middle name. Even your signature on the master trust is encrypted through corporate vote delegation. If someone tries to follow the thread, they won't find me, she finished. Elias nodded. They'll find shell companies investing through public markets. 1,000 silent shadows. Lila leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling like she was calculating oxygen. "I don't want them destroyed," she said. "Not all of them." Elias didn't respond. He never did when the words turned personal. "I want them replaced," she continued, "not collapsed. I want to cut out the parts that rot and leave the rest to heal." He nodded again. "We start with 85%. She paused. "Not enough to trigger board notice." "Exactly," Elias confirmed. "You'll remain invisible until 20, but we can use institutional acquisition agreements to stall disclosure. Once we hit 18%, the whispers start. At 22%, you're no longer a rumor. You're a force." Lila stared at the word force like it had grown teeth. "Then let's begin," she said. And so it did. Over the next several days, the invisible network began moving. One holding firm acquired a chunk of preferred shares from an East Coast bank. Another bought into Class C options through a pension fund. A third signed a convertible note agreement buried beneath a routine commercial lending deal. Torres Foods, battered and bleeding from scandal, didn't even see it coming. Their stock was cheap, now wounded reputation, frantic leadership, unstable futures. But beneath the wreckage, the bones were still strong. Distribution lines, packaging assets, manufacturing rights. Lila knew the architecture from childhood. She knew where the walls were weak, where the pipes groaned. And now she was buying it back, brick by brick. Each transaction was small, unnoticeable. Like flicking off switches in an abandoned house before someone realized you were inside. And in between the legal briefings and the silent signatures, Lila returned to the kitchen. Not to escape, to remember. At 3:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, she rolled out dough for bolillos, the Mexican bread her grandmother used to make on Sundays. The original recipe was stained and faded, barely legible, but the rhythm in her hands remembered what her eyes no longer needed to read. Knead, fold, rest, bake. When she bit into the finished roll hot from the oven, steam kissed her lips and salt bloomed on her tongue. It was right. The flavor hadn't changed. After all this time, the bread still knew her. She closed her eyes. Esperanza had always said food carried truth, no matter what lies the family told. Lila placed one bolillo in a brown paper bag. She wrote nothing on the outside, but inside she folded a cashier's check for $5,000 and slipped it beneath the loaf. That night, she mailed it overnight delivery, no return address, to her mother's assisted care home. It wasn't charity, it wasn't reconciliation. It was proof of life. She'd been sending those envelopes every month for the past 2 years, always with different names, a neighbor who remembers, a daughter from another timeline, someone you taught to braid dough. This time she wrote one who was left but never forgot. The packages were always accepted, never acknowledged. And that was enough, for now. Meanwhile, in Boston, Clara was sweating. She sat in the Torres boardroom, a glass box perched atop the company's tower, and tapped her pen against her tablet like a metronome of suspicion. Vespera Capital, she repeated. That name keeps popping up. A junior analyst looked up confused. They're part of the Eastbridge Investment Group portfolio, right? They weren't, Clara replied. Not until last quarter. And now they're buying Class B options through 2 separate pipelines. So, Clara spun the tablet, revealing a spreadsheet. So no one increases exposure this aggressively unless they're posturing. For what leverage, she said flatly. The analyst frowned. I mean, that's how markets work, right? Clara leaned in, voice low. You ever seen a ghost knock on a door it used to own? The analyst didn't respond. He wasn't paid to understand metaphor. But Clara's gut knew something was off. She hadn't made it to the top by accident. She'd made it by eliminating accidents. When her father-in-law began aging out of authority, Clara had filled the void. Quietly, methodically, she was the architect behind cost optimizations, supply chain reworks, even the now infamous canned goods line. She'd cleaned her fingerprints off the Releno scandal, but the heat had changed the texture of her world. And now something else was slithering through the walls. She opened her laptop and searched for Vespera Capital. No founders listed, no photographs, no phone numbers, just a generic investor relations email. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Then she typed Vespera CEO real name. Nothing. She clicked over to LinkedIn. Nothing. Then to Instagram, Twitter, Reddit. Still nothing. Too clean? Too clean meant one of two things. Either it was a new front for a major private equity firm, or it was personal. And Clara knew personal, because ghosts don't usually want revenge. They want return. She remembered the last time she saw Lila. Not at the wedding, not directly, but weeks before that outside Elias's office when Clara had gone there on a tip about a startup founder rumored to be buying into Eastbridge portfolios. She remembered passing a woman in the hallway in a wool coat. Didn't see her face. But the eyes. Her stomach sank. No, couldn't be. Lila was gone. Irrelevant. Playing cupcake wars in Brooklyn or wherever her nonsense bakery was. She hadn't even shown up to their father's last birthday despite the polite lie that she was traveling. But what if? Clara picked up her phone and dialed private security. I need a background sweep on Vespera Capital, she said. Every shell, every account, get me whoever signs the wires, and check any contact with known Torres relatives. The man on the line whistled. That's sensitive. That's survival, Clara snapped. She hung up and stared out the boardroom window. If it was Lila, if the baker came back, Clara would need to decide whether to bury her again, this time deeper, or cut a deal before the knives came out. The photo arrived via text at 2:14 p.m. A grainy but unmistakable image. Lila hair tied back navy coat, open just enough to reveal the Bloomline lapel pins stepping through the mirrored glass doors of her San Francisco headquarters. Clara stared at it with a stillness usually reserved for weapons or pregnancy tests. She'd sent a private investigator to Bloomline 2 weeks earlier, not because she was certain, but because her instincts had started whispering in a voice she hadn't heard since law school, a voice that said, if it's too clean, it's personal. Now the photo confirmed it. Lila Evelyn Torres. No, Lila Esperanza Evelyn Torres. Clara smirked as she tapped the image to zoom in. The face was sharper now. No makeup, no jewelry, but the expression, it was the same one from that ridiculous dinner argument a decade ago. The same fire barely disguised under politeness. Clara opened her contacts, scrolled, found the number buried under an old alias. She didn't hesitate. The phone rang once, then again. On the third ring, Lila picked up. Silence. Clara smiled and said nothing for 4 seconds. Let it simmer. Hello, Lila finally said, her voice even. I almost didn't believe it was you, Clara replied sweetly. But the Esperanza in your signature gave you away. A long pause. Then Lila answered flatly, You shouldn't have that name. Well, Clara purred, you shouldn't have Bloomline. And yet, here we are. Another silence, a different kind. I'm assuming this isn't a social call, Lila said. Clara leaned back in her chair and stared out over the Boston skyline. Her nails tapped against the glass of her whiskey tumbler. "Let's be clear," she said. "I don't care about bakeries. But I do care when a ghost from the family tree starts manipulating market shares of the company I help run. You've been very clever, Lila, but not quite clever enough." "I've been more than clever," Lila said. "I've been patient." "Oh, darling," Clara said with a soft laugh. "Don't mistake patience for immunity, because I have one thing you don't." "What's that?" Access Clara said, to headlines and scandal and the public's appetite for drama. She paused just long enough for the words to land. "If I were to release proof that the CEO of Bloomline America's darling anonymous bakery brand is actually a disowned heiress who secretly created a shell corporation to take over her father's company," she let it dangle. "You think that would damage me?" Lila said. Her tone was steady, but Clara heard the faintest hitch beneath it. Human. Tired. Dangerous. "I think," Clara replied smoothly, "that you've spent 10 years crafting a reputation of quiet genius, the mysterious success. The brand built from struggle. That all dies the moment they find out who you really are, a Torres. The narrative becomes about money, not merit. Blood, not brilliance." Clara sipped her drink. She always made sure to sip when she dropped the knife. "I want 2 million, she said calmly, "in clean accounts wired within 72 hours. Then I forget what I know. Permanently." The silence on the other end stretched until it snapped. "No," Lila said. One word, sharp, unsentimental. Clara blinked. "No," she repeated, as if the syllable itself were a foreign language. "No deal, no money, no silence." Clara lowered her glass. "Lila, this is not a bluff." "I know it's not," Lila said. "That's what makes it so familiar. You've always been good at threatening people with their own reflection. Then you understand the consequences." "I understand exactly what you're doing," Lila said, her voice gaining force now like an engine warming. "You think you've trapped me in the same room I was locked in 10 years ago. The same room where I was told I'd never succeed, never belong, never be anything more than a pretty disappointment." Clara's jaw tightened. Lila continued, "But I broke the lock on that room the night I slept on a flower crate and decided I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on someone else's leash." "You're not invincible," Clara said a bit too quickly. No, Lila agreed. "But I'm not afraid of being seen anymore. And that's what terrifies you." Clara didn't respond. "I didn't go through 10 years of being invisible," Lila said softly, "just to pay off the woman who helped bury me in the first place." And that was the real twist of the knife, because Lila had never forgotten. Not the fake sympathy. Not the phone calls Clara accidentally leaked to family members. Not the video she recorded at the dinner table then passed around as an inside joke among the siblings. Lila's bakery breakdown. "You think you're the only one who got cut," Clara said suddenly, voice cracking at the edges. "I had to marry into that name. Do you know what that's like?" Lila exhaled, a long, almost pitying sound. "Yes," she said, "I do." Then the line went dead. Clara stared at the phone like it had betrayed her, because she thought she'd scared Lila. But what she had done was awaken something worse. Resolve. Lila sat in the silence of her office, hand still on the phone. She didn't tremble, didn't flinch. She stood up and walked into the test kitchen, took a knife, began slicing lemons. Each slice landed clean. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about removing rot before it spread. She turned to her assistant. "Call Elias," she said. "We accelerate." "Accelerate what?" "Everything," Lila said. Clara just declared war. "I'm done hiding from people I could outbake in my sleep." In that moment, something shifted. Not the facts, not the stakes, but the temperature of her intent. Clara had just placed a knife in Lila's hands, and Lila finally decided to use it. It was a Thursday morning, but the air inside the Torres Foods executive boardroom felt like a courtroom at midnight, hot with tension, cold with judgment. The meeting was scheduled for 900 a.m., but people arrived early like mourners before a wake. Alfredo Torres sat at the head of the table in a suit that had once fit his legacy, now clinging too tightly to a body grown brittle from stress and shame. His hair, once jet black and immovable, had surrendered to streaks of white. But his jaw was still set the same way, like a stone that refused to erode. Clara walked in precisely at 8:58, flanked by two junior execs who wouldn't meet her eyes. She was dressed in a navy power dress, lips lined sharp, but something in her posture sagged under the weight of impending exposure. She took her seat without looking at Alfredo. The rest of the board followed 9 men, 2 women, none of them family, none of them loyal. Loyalty had been the first thing to rot after the scandal broke. Now all that remained was liability and liquidation. Alfredo cleared his throat. "This emergency meeting has been called," he said, "because we are out of time. No theatrics, no warm preamble, just the weight of collapse on everyone's shoulders. We're hemorrhaging capital," added James, the CFO. "Our insurance settlements are pending, but even if favorable, they won't cover the recall costs and vendor litigation. We have 5 weeks, maybe 6, before payroll defaults." A hush spread like mold across the room. "Options," someone asked. That's when Clara spoke calm and mechanical. "We've had 3 offers," she said. One from Maxwell Holdings hostile terms, total brand overhaul, loss of family naming rights. One from Cornerstone Ventures Limited Investment, but they require liquidation of 40% of our staff and shelving of 4 product lines. And the third, asked a man near the window. Clara hesitated, just enough to wrinkle the air. "Vespera Capital," she said finally. "Private firm. Quiet but liquid. Their offer came in this morning." She clicked a remote. The projector hummed. A logo appeared, Vespera's stylized V in deep black against a blank white background. "They're offering to buy 51% of Torres Foods' outstanding shares," she said, "in exchange for $110 million in direct investment. Immediate cash injection, no delay." The room shifted. Eyes darted. Chairs creaked. "And the conditions?" asked James. Clara pressed another button. A second slide appeared. Condition 1. Full replacement of existing executive leadership. Condition 2. Torres family members may retain advisory roles but hold no operational authority. Condition 3. Public disclosure of executive reorganization within 48 hours of acquisition. Clara's voice flattened. "In short, they want to save the company, but only if the current management, including me, Alfredo, and James, step down." The silence that followed could have cracked glass. Alfredo's mouth twitched, but no sound came out. Finally, he leaned forward. "This is a hostile takeover dressed in diplomacy." "They're offering to save what we built," Clara shot back. "The other offers want to dismantle it." "You're suggesting we sign away everything we are," Alfredo said, each word slow and deliberate. "No," she said. "I'm saying we're no longer who we think we are." James leaned in. "Who is Vespera? Where's this money coming from?" "They're anonymous," Clara said. "Too anonymous," Alfredo growled. "Money doesn't need a face," Clara replied. "Just traction." "They want us gone," he barked, slamming his palm against the table. "That's not investment. That's exile." "No," Clara snapped back. "That's consequence." The temperature in the room shifted violently. "You're the one who let this happen?" Clara said, not shouting but sharp enough to draw blood. "You let me run wild with supply chains. You looked the other way when I cut corners. You wanted quarterly wins. I delivered them. You liked the profit, Alfredo, even if it came from silence." Alfredo's hands clenched. He looked smaller suddenly, like a man finally catching up with the cost of his choices. "You used the Torres name like a shield," Clara continued. "And now it's a target." "We are family," Alfredo said, voice cracking. "No," she said. "We were a brand. Now we're a scandal." One of the board members, an older man named Garrett, raised a hand. "We can't make this emotional. The company is dying. If Vespera is offering oxygen, we don't ask who's holding the tank." The table nodded reluctantly. Alfredo closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. What's the vote threshold? Majority, Clara said. 6 out of 11. A pause. Then Garrett spoke. I vote yes. So did James. Then another and another. Alfredo watched helpless as hands rose like daggers. Finally, it was 6. Done, Clara exhaled. Alfredo turned to her, eyes hollow. You've replaced me, he said. I had to, she whispered. Then someone asked the question that had been crawling beneath every sentence. Who runs Vespera? Everyone turned to Clara. She hesitated, and that was all it took to spark suspicion. Clara, Alfredo asked, his voice hoarse. Do you know? She held their gaze, then said nothing. Because it had just occurred to her. What if she'd guessed wrong? What if it really wasn't a hedge fund? What if it really was her? Lila. Her name suddenly hung like fog in the room, unspoken but thick. Alfredo leaned back. Find out, he said. If we've sold the Torres name, I want to know who's wearing it now. Everyone stared at the logo on the screen. That cold, perfect V. And for the first time in decades, Alfredo Torres didn't recognize the empire he'd built, because someone else was steering it now, and she knew every weakness in its walls. The conference room had never been this silent. Not when Torres Foods launched its first global campaign, not even when the scandal broke. But now every chair was filled, every breath was held, every clock forgotten. Until the door opened. She didn't storm in. She didn't need to. She walked like the floor already belonged to her. Dark pantsuit, no jewelry, hair pulled back tight. And in her hand a folder. Not thick, not dramatic, just precise. The moment Lila Torres stepped past the threshold, everything that had ever been dismissed, laughed at, cast out, stepped in with her. No one said a word. Clara's eyes widened first. A gasp escaped, then vanished behind a clenched jaw. Her skin paled as if all the lies she ever told came rushing to the surface at once. The three brothers froze. Alfredo, who had aged a decade in the last month, sat perfectly still. The only movement was his fingers slowly tightening around the armrest of his chair, and their mother, Lila Torres, dropped the pen in her hand. It clattered onto the table like a signal no one had prepared for. Lila stood at the head of the table, not the seat of honor, the seat of accountability. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't smile. My name is Lila Esperanza Torres, she said. I am the CEO of Bloomline Bakery and the sole owner of Vespera Capital. Alfredo's back hit the chair like a man who had been shot with a name. Clara didn't blink. She stared, but her hands slowly retreated beneath the table. I am not here for revenge, Lila continued, though many of you have earned it. A beat. I am here to rebuild the name you let rot. She slid the folder onto the table and flipped it open. Inside, a plan. Sharp, structured, color-coded. This, she said, is the future of Torres Foods. She began, no hesitation, no apology. A full audit of all third-party suppliers. Contracts renegotiated based on certified sustainability standards. A 12-month rollout of the Green Kitchen program across all factories, cutting emissions by 42%. She turned a page. A partnership with Bloomline's Artisanal Research Division to reformulate top-selling products using natural preservation techniques. No chemicals, no compromise. Another page. A rebranding campaign. Not to erase the past, but to own it. We'll call it Rooted, Real, Remade. The brothers said nothing, because they had nothing to say. Lila Torres covered her mouth with her hand. But the tears came anyway. Not loud, not performative, just steady, the kind of grief that recognizes truth too late. Lila didn't stop. We will lay off no employees. Instead, we'll retrain. She paused. Let that sink in. Because this company failed not from scandal, but from cowardice. From forgetting who planted its first seed. Her eyes met Alfredo's. He didn't look away. I remember, he whispered. The day you left, you wore your grandmother's apron. Lila nodded, but there was no warmth in it. You tore me out like the cancer, she said, because I didn't fit the legacy. I didn't understand, he replied. No, she said, you understood perfectly. You just didn't like the shape I took. Clara stood up. Everyone turned. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. She simply picked up her purse, pushed in her chair, and walked out. No one followed. The silence left behind her was more honest than any speech she could have given. Lila waited for the door to shut before continuing. We've already acquired the 51%. The paperwork is final. But I'm offering this board something rare choice. She gestured to the folder. You can stay. Work under the new structure. Or leave, and the severance packages are already calculated. Alfredo's hands trembled. He had once crushed rivals with boardroom speeches. Now he struggled to form a full sentence. I built this company from flour and sweat, he said quietly. And I will make sure it's not remembered for mold and lawsuits, Lila answered. He looked at her not with hatred, but with a strange, crumbling awe. You're not who I thought you'd become. She finally gave a soft smile. I'm exactly who Grandma Esperanza hoped I'd be. A long pause. Then Lila Torres stood up, tears still fresh. She walked slowly around the table. Every eye followed her. When she reached Lila, she placed a hand on her daughter's cheek. I never stopped thinking of you, she said. Lila didn't respond. Because forgiveness isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's just not pulling away. The room remained still. Lila turned back to the board. We begin restructuring tomorrow. You'll receive schedules by end of day. Then before anyone could stop her, she walked out the same way she came in. Not triumphant, just necessary. And behind her, Alfredo Torres finally lowered his head not in defeat, but in something closer to humility. Because for the first time, the family legacy didn't belong to the past. It belonged to the daughter they'd forgotten, who never forgot what they once were. Lila didn't hesitate when the papers were slid across the table. She didn't need to read them again. She had written every line herself. The agreement was clear. No lawsuits, no trials, just silence. Clara sat across from her, legs crossed, face perfectly powdered. The kind of woman who had always known how to use charm as armor. But today she looked like a soldier, stripped of rank, still wearing her medals, but no longer welcome on any battlefield. No public statements, no interviews, no whisper campaigns. Lila said, her voice like tempered steel. You sign this, you disappear completely. Clara looked at the pen, then at Lila, then at the woman sitting beside her, Vespera's head of legal affairs. Why are you doing this? Clara asked finally. You could destroy me. Lila leaned in slightly, elbows on the table, fingers steepled. Because this was never about you. She said it not with grace, but with cold truth. Clara had always thought herself the nemesis. Lila had always been aiming higher. The pen hit the paper with a single signature. No grand gesture, no apology. Just an exit. By 10:00 a.m., Clara Torres was no longer listed on any public or private board registry. Her email access was revoked. Her office was emptied. She would spend the next decade pretending her fall was voluntary. Meanwhile, Lila stepped into the full light of her legacy. That same day, across every financial news outlet, a headline rippled through the wires like a whispered confession. Vespera Capital's mystery CEO, revealed as Bloomline founder, a former law student, disowned by Torres family. Accompanying the headline, a photo of Lila walking out of the press room in Paris expression. Unreadable, a single flower pin on her lapel, the one her grandmother Esperanza had once sewn onto her apron. Within hours, Torres' food stock surged 22%. Investors no longer saw scandal, they saw strategy. They saw survival. More importantly, they saw someone willing to save a family name without begging it to love her back. 2 weeks later, Bloomline was awarded Artisan Innovator of the Year at the European Food Festival in Lyon. Lila stood alone on stage in front of chefs, scientists, and CEOs. She didn't mention her family, not once. She talked about fermentation, about soil quality, about ingredients older than borders. She spoke like someone who had baked through war. And at the end, when asked about her rise, she simply said, "Sometimes hunger is the greatest inheritance. But even triumph tastes different when it's quiet." Back in Boston, beneath a dim porch light, Lila knocked softly. The house hadn't changed much. Yellowing siding, the sound of a TV always on inside, the smell of jasmine from the overgrown garden. Her mother opened the door. Lila Torres looked smaller now, as if the weight of her silence had finally caught up to her. She didn't speak. She just stepped aside. Lila walked in. Into the kitchen. The same cracked tile, the same humming fridge, and the old wooden recipe box. She opened it. There, still wrapped in twine, was the card labeled Esperanza's Pan de Leche. Her mother sat down at the table. Lila placed the ingredients in front of them. Flour, milk, yeast, thyme. They didn't talk much as they baked. Just small motions, hands finding rhythm, ghosts moving through them. And when the dough rose and the scent of home filled the room again, Elena whispered, "Do you think you can forgive me?" It was the first time she'd used the word you in a decade. Lila didn't answer immediately. She simply slid the tray into the oven, turned the knob, and sat across from her mother. "I think," she said, "finally I needed to stop trying to be forgiven. To remember I deserved to be born." Elena nodded. No protest, no justification. Just a quiet kind of pain that only mothers and daughters understand. Outside, the wind rustled the jasmine. Inside, something softer rose. Not just bread, but the air between them. And for the first time in years, they waited together. The spine of the book had long since cracked. Its cover, once a proud navy leather embossed with Harvard Law Review, now bent in 3 places and smelled faintly of dust and cloves. When Lila opened it, the yellowed page fluttered gently, and a thin sheet of parchment slipped out a recipe card, the handwriting unmistakably her grandmother's. Esperanza had hidden her life's legacy between someone else's expectations. Flour 300 grams, milk warm, not hot, yeast alive like memory. Instruction: don't overmix, some resistance is good for growth. The irony hit hard. A bakery dream buried in a law book. A quiet rebellion wrapped in a maternal prophecy. Lila smiled. Not bitterly, but with the kind of smile that comes only when you realize someone saw your path even before you dared to walk it. Later that morning, she walked alone to the cemetery outside Charlestown. The air was sharp with fall. Maple leaves scattered across the old stones like folded regrets. She stopped at the plot marked Esperanza Ruiz Torres, 1928-2007. There was no bouquet, only a handwritten letter folded inside a small tin box wrapped in red bakery twine. She placed it at the base of the headstone. "Con đã không bỏ giấc mơ," it began. "I didn't give up the dream. Chỉ là con cần thời gian để khiến họ hiểu nó xứng đáng. I just needed time to make them see it was worth it." The wind stirred the paper as if her grandmother were reading it herself. That night, back at Bloomline's flagship store in Brooklyn, Lila stood in the prep kitchen long after hours. The counters were cleaned, ovens cooling, staff gone home. She kneaded dough in silence. No podcast, no music, just the rhythm of hands and flour and faith. The bell on the front door rang once. She didn't turn around. She knew the footsteps. "Sasha," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. Her youngest sister stood at the threshold of the kitchen, her face nervous but steady. She held a small folder in one hand, dressed in slacks that were slightly too formal for this place. "I didn't know if I should come," Sasha said. "But I saw what you did. I saw everything, and I want to be part of it." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Part of what?" Sasha walked closer, putting the folder on the table. Inside, a rough business plan. Ideas for new flourless lines, charts, even some mock-ups of eco-friendly packaging. "I've been working on these for months. I just didn't know how to show you. Or if you'd even want me near this." There was a pause. Lila picked up one of the charts, studied it, then looked back up. "You want to work here?" Sasha nodded. "Yes, I want to learn. I want to earn it. Not because I'm a Torres, because this what you built, it's the first thing in this family that actually feels alive." Lila walked slowly toward the back shelf, pulled out an apron. Plain. No name embroidered. She held it out. "Then you start on Monday." Sasha blinked as kitchen assistant Lila said, handing her the apron. You sweep, you weigh flour, you rotate racks, and you show up early. Because this isn't just a brand, it's not a chain. She paused, then added, voice lower. This is blood. Later that evening, Sasha stayed behind. Helped fold towels, refilled bins, wrote down baking times on sticky notes without being asked. And when she finally left, Lila remained in the kitchen, turning off one light at a time. She walked past the fridge where an old photo had been taped up her as a child, covered in flour, standing beside her grandmother with a lopsided smile. One generation had hidden the recipe, another had resurrected it, and now a third was asking for entry not to a boardroom, but to a kitchen. This was how bloodlines truly healed, not by force, not by inheritance, but by choice. The notary's pen hovered for a second too long. Are you sure? She asked. Lila didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the paperwork one final time, 6 pages of legal transformation. At the top, petition for legal name change. At the bottom, from Lila Esperanza Torres to Lila Esperanza Bloom. She signed with steady fingers. The ink felt heavier than it should have. Behind the pen wasn't just a signature. It was a burial of rejection, of shame, of dinners where she was asked to sit silently while the men talked about real careers, of birthdays ignored because she wasn't going anywhere with butter and flour, of watching her grandmother's recipes hidden in law books while everyone pretended not to see. But also it was a rebirth. She had chosen her new name as carefully as she chose the temperature for baking a croissant. Esperanza! For her grandmother, the only person who ever told her that food could speak louder than words. Bloom, for the bakery, for what had grown from ashes, for what had never been meant to survive but had flourished anyway. It was no longer about separating from the Torres legacy. It was about transcending it. 65 Haru. The stage at the World Culinary Assembly in Lisbon gleamed under soft spotlights. 100 chefs from across the world had gathered, from avant-garde chemists in Tokyo to sourdough sages from Bavaria. Lila, dressed in a deep maroon pantsuit with no jewelry, stood at the podium like she belonged there because she did. But no one knew her name yet. The MC read from the card, and now the keynote will be delivered by the woman behind Bloomline and Vespera Capital, Ms. Lila Bloom. There was a ripple in the crowd. Some whispered, was this that Lila Bloom, the one who turned artisan pastry into a global movement? The mysterious CEO whose bakery chain funded eco-agriculture in 7 countries. She stepped forward, cleared her throat, and began. I was born into a family that ran a food empire, she said. And for most of my life I was told I could eat from it but never build it. Silence. They wanted me to follow the law. I followed the dough. Laughter. But here's the truth, she continued. Family isn't where you come from. Family is what you build when everything else falls apart. Family is who stays in the kitchen when the ovens break and the orders double. Family is who believes in the recipe before there's even a table to serve it on. A beat. Today, I stand here not because I was born into legacy, but because I rebuilt one from scratch with burnt hands and borrowed rent. My name is Lila Esperanza Bloom, and I believe in kitchens more than boardrooms, in mothers more than margins, in rebuilding not revenge. A pause. Food is forgiveness if you let it be. The applause began slowly, then roared. 67 Haru. Backstage, a group of 5 women waited. They didn't have security tags or floral bouquets, just envelopes in their hands. Ms. Bloom, the eldest one, asked. Lila turned, smiled warmly. We just wanted to thank you, she said. You probably don't remember, but 3 years ago, you funded a program for women culinary students who were denied scholarships because they had kids or were over 30. Lila blinked. I remember, she said. It was a small thing. No one of them whispered. It wasn't. Each handed her a letter. Inside were notes, handwritten, misspelled, some tear-stained. They told stories of second chances, of food trucks opened, of recipes passed from daughters to sons, of family dinners cooked not from guilt, but joy. "We're the proof the woman said that your second life helped build ours." Lila clutched the letters like old recipes rediscovered. For years she thought she was baking for survival. Now she realized she had been feeding a revolution. 69:30. The press waited outside the assembly. Not pushy, but present. Lenses glinted, microphones raised. Lila stepped through the grand hallway, her steps deliberate. The camera flash caught her profile, the sharp cheekbones of her father, the posture of her grandmother, and eyes that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Someone called her name. She stopped. "What would you say a reporter asked to your family if they're watching?" She thought for a moment, then replied, "I'd say thank you for letting me go, because the best parts of me were born after I left." And then, without waiting for more, she kept walking. The door opened to the night air, and behind her, the Torres name quietly closed. The application was declined again. Clara stared at the rejection email, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. Once the queen of Torres Foods' boardroom, now she sat in a kitchen chair that creaked under its own age in a suburban rental on the edge of nowhere. Her resume read like a monument to power. But the food world, brutal in its quiet judgment, remembered the scandal. And worse, remembered the girl she tried to silence. She closed her laptop with a brittle snap. Her gaze drifted to the wall where a diploma once hung. All that remained now was a sun-bleached square. 72 Wevru. In another part of the state, Alfredo Torres wiped down a counter with the precision of an old man trying to earn something he could no longer buy. The culinary school smelled of detergent and cumin. Students in stained aprons ignored him not out of disrespect, but because he had become unthreatening. Just a fixture. Chef Alfredo, one of them, asked gently, "How do you know if a broth has turned?" He smiled. "When it stops remembering where it came from." It was the first honest thing he had said in months. 73:30. That same evening in his mailbox, Alfredo found a handwritten letter. The seal bore the insignia of Bloomline pressed in deep green wax. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the script that had once filled grocery lists on the fridge. "Dad, you told me once that the family name was the only thing that mattered, but you forgot something. It only matters if it means something good. I don't want you to apologize. That's not what this is about. I just need you to know this. No one deserves to be left behind. But the first person who needs to change is you." Lila. His hands didn't tremble, but he folded the letter twice, pressed it to his chest, and sat in the dark a long time. 75 War. At the original Bloomline shop in New York, the smell of caramelized sugar wrapped around the walls like a childhood memory. Lila stood alone in the early hours of morning apron tied at the waist, sleeves rolled, no cameras, no board meetings, no titles. In front of her a simple ball of dough, a metal scraper, and the old wooden rolling pin her grandmother had once used. She moved with reverence. The cinnamon butter glaze was warm to the touch. She sliced the dough with care, 12 even rolls spiraling like tiny galaxies. As the oven clicked to life, she pulled out a box, hand-folded. On its lid, a label in her writing. For those they called failures. It wasn't marketing. It was a verdict, a gift, a war cry wrapped in sweetness. Sect 30. She tied the ribbons, slowly stepped back. Morning light stretched through the storefront window, gold and deliberate. It danced across her apron, her flour-dusted fingers, her cheek. She looked up, not toward any customer or employee, but out the glass, beyond the street, beyond the city, toward something both real and symbolic. She smiled, not wide, not triumphant, but full, whole. It was not the smile of someone who had won. It was the smile of someone who had rebuilt without permission and left the door unlocked behind her. The end.